we are very privileged actually to have her. The Edorois community is a group of, they are mostly known as hunter-gatherers, right? Pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, and they are very small community, and you are a member of that group. So really, we are privileged to listen to her today and to hear from her, who is coming from that community, as opposed to hearing from people who are going to study that group and coming to talk to us. So, Jolene, karibu.
Asante sana. Thank you so much for the introduction. I have a cold, so my voice is not very clear. As you have heard, my name is Jolene Kanyaris, and I work for the National Museums of Kenya as a research scientist at the Center for Biodiversity Department, Wetlands and Marine Section. And I'm a member of an indigenous community living around Lake Bogoria, which is called an Endorais community. So in this presentation, I will highlight some of the ways of conserving biodiversity in scientific, comparing like scientific methods and traditional methods. So to start, we define biodiversity. What's biodiversity? The sum total of the various life forms at various biological levels. We have ecosystem diversity, habitat diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So when we talk about ecosystem diversity, we are talking about forests, deserts, oceans, wetlands, and etc. When we talk about species diversity, we have different groups of organisms, and in each group we have different species. Like for example, the fish, we have different kinds of fish with different genetic makeup. So what is the importance of biodiversity? They have ecological values, ethics and moral values. Example of an ecological value is pollination. And example of aesthetic value is, like for example, as you can see in that photo, we have the Endorais community enjoying a dance, and that's a sphere made of a plant species called Criwea bicolor, and that's a skin from the colobus monkey, and that's a shield from the buffalo skin. So when it comes to utilitarian values, we have biodiversity as source of food. And now, despite the importance of biodiversity, we are losing biodiversity at a very high rate, and the reason why we are losing biodiversity is mostly due to human activities. For example, habitat destruction, overexploitation of bioresources, pollution, invasive species, climate change, and policy failure. So, interestingly, there is a similarity between the loss of biodiversity and also loss of cultural diversity and linguistics. So these two are related, such that when a species is lost, it goes with the knowledge on that species. That's why we need to conserve biodiversity. So what's biodiversity conservation? It incorporates preservation, maintenance, sustainable use, recovery, and enhancements of biodiversity. Some of the scientific measures used for biodiversity conservation are the zoos, the botanic gardens, seed banks, national parks, and game reserves. And we have many countries have ratified several conventions for biodiversity conservation, and in this, most of these conventions, they mandate greater inclusion of indigenous people and their knowledge in biodiversity conservation. Some of the convention is Convention on Biological Diversity, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the United Nations Declaration of the Right of Indigenous People, and also the Ramsar Convention. So in Kenya, we have a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and in this strategy and action plan, it recognizes the link between nature and culture, emphasizes on revitalizing cultural practices, adoption of participatory management, environmentally friendly activities, and even the Lake Bogoria National Reserve Management Plan also recognizes the role of indigenous people. But the question is, are these just paper documentation meant to fulfill the requirements of the signed international conventions? So we will watch a small documentary highlighting some of the traditional methods used for biodiversity conservation.
Can you increase the volume somehow?
Take it a little bit.
Okay.
Take it back.
Can you do some settings on that?
Oh, okay, so. Oh, okay. Can I bring my charger?
Yes.
Okay, now we can start.
Lake Bogoria National Reserve is a Ramsar site and a World Heritage Site that lies at an altitude of 975 meters in Rift Valley, Kenya. It is famous for its hot springs and natural spas. The reserve also has a high conservation value, with at least 12 of its animal species listed as endangered species in the IUCN Red List. The Endorois community are indigenous to the area and have learned to coexist with the wildlife for many years. They are traditionally a pastoralist community, but have learned to grow crops too, to diversify their livelihoods. This traditional way of life has encouraged biodiversity conservation in and around Lake Bogoria National Reserve. Different cultural values are attached to different plants, animals, and ecosystems. For example, some wild animals have a totemic importance. There are a total of 13 clans within the whole Endorois community, and these 13 clans are subdivided into lineages and named after their ancestor. Each clan had a particular name bestowed to their women, a totemic animal, and a totemic symbol marked on their livestock. The totem system prohibits sex and marriage between members of the same clan. The totem system serves as a comprehensive network of wildlife protection. Some animals are important for ceremonies. The grey-crowned crane, for example, is a bird affiliated with wisdom and linked to circumcision. The greater kudu horn is used as a trumpet for a variety of purposes, such as hailing the beginnings of meetings, hunts, and ceremonies. The horn is kept by one person and it is shared among the community. The colobus monkey skin is worn by the most talented dancers in the community when performing traditional dances. Some traditional dances were inspired by wildlife. For example, the flamingo dance. The elders discussed rules governing the proper use of the habitats. This involved planning for the conservation of land, plants, animal, and water resources. Rituals are performed when there is a bad omen, for example, of famine, spread of disease, or even when Lake Bogoria produces an unpleasant odor. It is performed by blameless men, both young and old, and the offerings come from the blameless people within the community. These sacred ritualistic places are therefore safeguarded, contributing to an overall conservation of wildlife. Sacred plants, known as korosek, honey beer and milk are used to perform the ritual. Young boys and girls are sent to bring the sacred plants with the help of an elderly member of the community. After the ritual, some of the sacred plants are shared among the attendees and used to bless their homes and livestock. The rest of it is burnt. That smoke that goes up is believed to be sending a message to God. Land rotational system safeguarding against overgrazing are decided through social gatherings called barazas. Swamps are supposed to be closed during the rainy seasons, and the closed season is supposed to be respected by all members of the community, to a point that if someone accidentally let their livestock go into the swamp during this time, the person has to report himself to the elders so that they can perform a ritual on him in order to avoid a curse upon his livestock. This person will then offer a bull to be slaughtered and local brew for the requested ritual. Before the swamp is reopened for livestock grazing, a ritual called Sutetab Sawaiti has to be performed. Selective removal of a resource and allowing for replenishment of what was taken is a basic rule of conserving the natural resources. To appreciate all they have received from nature, the NRO's people traditionally pay for ecosystem services. This means that they give out some items to nature before they take its resources. So why are we losing the battle to save wildlife? Just like any other protected area in Kenya, militarization is the approach used for protecting the endangered species in Bogoria. This approach often brands the local communities as invaders, poachers, and bandits, and has therefore escalated the divide between conservationists and the local Endorois community. The local community no longer has a sense of ownership of the wildlife and natural resources, and their cultural norms are breaking down as a result. They have therefore resorted to retaliation activities such as unsustainable use of their natural resources, illegal bushmeat hunting, and poisoning of the wildlife.
My name is Rafael Kmasov. I work with the county government of Baringo County, and I work as a wetlands officer. In Baringo, we do have areas and quite a number of wetlands, and it has been and the wetlands has been identified, and it covers an area of 1,080 kilometers squared in the entire county. In Baringo South, where we are now, we have quite a number of zones as well. We have Boy Swamp, we have Kesuba Swamp, we have Njora, which we are already in here, and we have very many swamps which has made Lake Bogoria to be one of the wetlands in the globe. In Kesubo entirely has already been degraded, and the causal effect of extreme degradation is one is overstocking, which has made many people, the people living around Kesubo swamp are pastoralists, and most of them keep animals, and without restriction they keep quite a number of animals which have changed the land to be degraded and overstocked. Entirely before its degradation, the swamp was very rich in biodiversity. It had a lot of wildlife, among them the warthogs, zebras, impalas, and the Kreta Kudu, the famous Kreta Kudu, which the county government has used it to be its logo. So Kreta Kudu was, Kesubo swamp was one of the niche, or rather the corridor and filter routes for Kreta Kudu, and since its degradation, all those animals have gone away, and some have been killed by the locals. Another thing which has made, which was in Kesubo swamp was bird life. The avian was very many in Kesubo swamp. It had a lot of biodiversity of birds, and more so the cranes, the endemic cranes, which are also very endangered in as far as an IUCN list is concerned. So all those birds which were in Kesubo have all gone. Most of them, the remaining birds are all the common birds which are around everywhere in the community. It was also a home to the ostrich, and now ostrich also have gone. It has been laying their eggs, nesting in Kesubo swamp, and since then the animals have always gone, and the birds have also gone. Generally, in the entire county, the wetlands are always in danger because of human encroachment, and all other demographic and activities which people normally do, and people does not regard. They always value the economic benefits, like farming and doing other things other than conservation. So, like for Kesubo, it has gone. It is almost done by human beings. It is almost degraded by human beings because of the urge for their livelihoods, the urge for to sustain their lives. So the only swamp which is now remaining, which still have the economic value and ecological value, is Loboi swamp.
In an attempt to find a solution to these challenges, this project engaged the local community and the conservation authorities at Lake Bogoria National Reserve through stakeholder forums and documenting indigenous knowledge that could be useful for biodiversity conservation. Had the authorities brought on board the local community in biodiversity conservation and management,
so far we've given bursaries up to a tune of almost 1,000 students, and this is for the last 3 years. The program started 2014-2015 financial year, and this is actually the achievement from the county government, Baringo County government, through the default functions, which is now being a benefit to the community, the entire community we are living around. And apart from that, we've done so many projects. We've done a pandan in Sinende, Kaptanai. We've done Chief's Office, several of them. And we've done one of Cultural Center and at Loboi. So this is actually the programs which is drawn from the community. We have no role in terms of managing the funds. Nevertheless, the county has thrown ahead. We've employed the liaison officer, the community liaison officer, which lies between the management and the community in terms of issues related, in development of the community and improvement of the livelihood of the community and the wise use of the natural resource.
There is need to include the local community in biodiversity conservation. This should be done by integrating the indigenous knowledge and the scientific knowledge in the management of the reserve. of the day, the local community should also get direct monetary benefits from the biodiversity conservation conducted in their own land.
Yeah, so I think in conclusion, in my opinion, I will suggest for integration of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge for management of and conservation of biodiversity. This can be done by including the management bylaws can be culled from the traditional cultural practices such as the taboos, beliefs, myths, and should be introduced in the natural resource registration framework. The local environmental tribunals and environmental committee can be strengthened to carry out prosecution and punishment to defaulters of the biodiversity conservation. Awareness campaigns through mass media to stress on the merits of indigenous knowledge should be done. Workshops and forums organized by environmental agencies to encourage exchange of experience among communities, and also annual events should be organized to gear to the promotion and preservation of the cultural heritage. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joelyn. It was a very interesting film, and the introduction and the talk. Thank you. So we'll take the next few minutes to ask questions, and I'll start. And my question is, I have two, which are linked actually. The first one is that I've seen all the totems are not from the big five, which are being protected by everyone else elsewhere. And you've talked about military involvement, militarization of the conservation. So what are they protecting? Because in other places they are protecting like the elephants, rhinos, and all the big animals. And then my second question is, your presentation is more on wetlands. Yeah? So how about the other places? Are there animals? Are they protected? What has happened to them?
Thank you so much for your questions. About the totems, we have just highlighted like 3, but we have a total of 13 clans, and every clan has their own totem. Like for me, my totem is buffalo. And not all the wild animals are totems. Some have other importance, like for ceremony purposes and other traditional importance. So not all the animals are totem, but quite a number of them are totems. So the case of militarization, as you know, all the protected areas in Kenya are managed by the KWS, and normally they have their rangers. And the role of the rangers is just to patrol and see whether Greater Kudu is in good condition, the local people are not poaching, and such kind of things. So it's mainly Greater Kudu and the other wild animals like the baboons, which are involved in the human-wildlife conflict, not the big five. And the reason why we have concentrated on wetlands, as I had told you earlier, I work for the National Museums at the wetland section, so that is mostly my area of specialization. And during this project, we collected a lot of data using focus group discussion, interviews, and questionnaires. So we are still in the process of analyzing the data and maybe writing a paper. So in the paper, we will have more information about the other ecosystems. Yeah, I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you, Jolene, for that, and well done. I've done a bit of filmmaking recently. It's actually quite difficult, and I thought you did that very nicely. I enjoyed that. But I think you should be much more ambitious, because I think your idea that we should integrate indigenous with scientific knowledge, it's like you could go so much further with that. And maybe you should, because what worries me in the way that it's been presented, and this is very common to the ways these kinds of issues are often presented, so I don't think it's your fault, I think it's a broader issue that's at stake here, but indigenous knowledge, whatever that means, always gets subsumed under an overarching nature narrative, right? So in this story, for example, indigenous knowledge is either, and practices, it's either the solution to a nature that's been desiccated, or it's the problem, right? And it's a problem when something has changed, when traditional practices are no longer held still in this thing from 100 years ago. If we held tradition still and everyone was doing what they've always done, then there wouldn't be a problem with biodiversity. The problem is, that things have changed, indigenous mechanisms, because they've changed and can no longer cope, and nature is now being desiccated, right? So in a sense, tradition, whatever that means, becomes both the solution and is at the same time the problem. And I think there's something much more interesting that could be going on here, which is the idea that, I've done a bit of work in another part of the region where totem is a big thing. Totems are also a big thing, so I understand what that's about. And as an anthropologist, traditionally totemic systems have been used, they've been studied as sort of using signs from so-called nature in order to organize society. That's how anthropologists traditionally would have done that, right? So symbols from nature to organize society. But actually, I think anthropologists wouldn't say that anymore. I think there's new thinking going on which says that actually, if we look at, say, totemic systems, what we have is a completely different way of understanding human-nature relations. Yeah? And where human-nature relations are not separate, where nature isn't sort of either the victim of or the success story of culture, but actually it's a much more complicated interrelationship. Yeah? I think if you started from that point, then it's less about making tradition fit the nature narrative and more about questioning the very nature narrative itself, which does this peculiar thing, which at one level tells everybody, stick to your culture, don't change. We can all have cars and have a modern life, and you have to stick with your grass skirt to protect biodiversity for us, for what? Our story about nature as pristine, right? And at the same time, then, and if you fail to do that, nature then is damaged, right? That story is incredibly damaging. And it's a real problem that the conservation lobby, and particularly the indigenous angle of the conservation lobby, have to deal with. I would have thought, and I know I'm ranting on a bit here, that there's massive opportunity in really understanding what's going on with these so-called traditional practices to put forward a completely different way of understanding the relationship of humans in nature.
Okay, thank you for your comment. So, myself, I'm a biologist studying something related with anthropology. So I just did this because after getting my master's in biology specialization, human ecology, most of the conservation career, most of the people who are in the conservation, sometimes biologists are just concentrating on the wildlife and excluding humans. So I wanted to do something which is linking humans and the nature. So I have little knowledge in anthropology. I'm still learning. So, but I think the locals are like excluded in terms of conservation. Even when developing the management plan, I read the management plan of Lake Bogoria National Reserve, and it was an integrated management plan, but I couldn't see anything about the nearby community, about the Endorais community. So that's why I thought I should do a study on the indigenous knowledge.
I mean, just to come back on you, I'm not saying what you've done is wrong. I just think you should go further. I think you should go much further. In other words, what you should try and do is use indigenous knowledge to question the very idea of biology in the first place. But, you know, the very idea that biology exists separate from anything that's not biology. The very idea that there's such a thing as ecology separate from human life, for example. So I guess I understand what you're doing. I think you're doing the right thing. I would just encourage you, you know, you've kind of done a mile, let's do the next 10 miles. Keep going, you know.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. Thank you, that was so interesting. I don't know anything about this area at all, so I really learnt a lot, and it was lovely to see the film. But maybe because I don't know this area that well, there were just some things I didn't understand very clearly, and I was wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about the story, because at the beginning you show this group of people who seem to have a very good relationship with the environment and the traditions that protect the environment, but then suddenly it starts talking about how actually the environment's been destroyed and the greater kudus have been killed, and then the project came in, and I was wondering kind of if you could just fill in historically what you see has happened. Is it that traditions have broken down and now with this project something new is happening, and how do you see it going forward from here, maybe as a result of the project, or you know, what's the current dynamics? Maybe just a little bit the history of the story and how it works.
Okay, thank you very much. So at the moment, the Endorais community are not practicing, like, you know, every society is changing and there is modernization and globalization, and everybody wants to be like, to embrace a new culture. So in this project, we wanted to document first indigenous knowledge and see how we can promote this knowledge, because the knowledge is still there, but it's with a certain group of community members who are growing old. But the coming generation, they don't bother themselves with these cultural practices. They think it's outdated, and they are just concentrating on maybe scientific methods. So we wanted to encourage people to embrace the indigenous way of life, and even we could go further and document the indigenous foods and all those kind of things. So at the moment there is a problem because the culture is breaking down, and there are some useful things in those cultural practices. Some of them, they might not be useful, but some are useful. So the ones which are useful for biodiversity conservation, we would like to promote them. Thank you.
How are you collecting and documenting in a way that makes it accessible to young people?
Yeah, like for this YouTube document, we have a YouTube. This documentary is in YouTube. So, and we are also raising funds to go back to Bogoria, and we will be screening the documentary, and we will be also involving maybe the wildlife clubs of the primary schools. They participate in making handcrafts, and also like those songs, they have messages on conservation and stuff like this. So we are promoting such kind of knowledge.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Francis Kariuki from Strathmore Law School, and I'm also interested in the field of indigenous knowledge, since I'm currently undertaking my doctorate studies on the protection of traditional ecological knowledge. So I was excited yesterday when I saw in Twitter the invitation for this seminar. And one of the challenge I have encountered in the course of my study is the question of protection of the knowledge, because as you may well be aware, there is the danger of the loss of the knowledge because of, as you have said, cultural changes, globalization, economic change. And so one of my concerns is with respect to the danger in terms of the state-centric approaches towards protection of this knowledge. And so I've been thinking of using the traditional institutions themselves, especially the institution of elder. And I don't know to what extent amongst the Ndorois, the institution of elders, for example, is being involved in the protection of the Ndorois' knowledge. And then my second concern is respect of who owns this knowledge, because if indigenous knowledge is to be protected, especially within the intellectual property framework, the question of ownership keeps on arising. How do you protect communally held knowledge within the intellectual property framework? Is it really owned by an individual, or is it owned by the community in a collective manner, you know? And then my other concern is the concern about how do you, for example, ensure this knowledge is protected as we go forward. For example, educating young children, because in one of the areas I've visited, the Kaya elders in Kilifi, I've seen the elders being killed. And you have heard this in the news. And these elders are the people who have the knowledge about the environment. So, and the youth, especially in Kilifi, they do not want to learn these old ways, because they are associating these old ways with witchcraft. So what other novel ways can we use to transmit this knowledge to the younger generation? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for your comments and your questions. I think in terms of involvement of the elders, I would suggest, I think it depends on the approach. Mostly if a researcher who is not from that community go and do research in maybe Ndorais, let me use the example of Ndorais community. If I was not from the community, if somebody else was doing this study, the results could be different. Because you know, in a community, like our culture prohibits like giving the knowledge to other people. So even for me myself, because I've not undergone some cultural practices like some rituals, there are some rituals which are normally performed. So there is some kind of knowledge I'll not get, and that one I have to accept because I've not, I'm from another generation and I'm supposed to be educated actually about the indigenous knowledge of my community. I only know a few practices and such kind of knowledge. So if you are going to do a study and if you want to meet the real people who owns this indigenous knowledge, you have to be very careful on the approach, because mostly when you approach such kind of communities, there are those people who are well articulated and they normally present themselves to be knowing everything, and they will maybe confuse you. So you have to be very careful on your approach and interact with them so that they are comfortable giving you the knowledge and knowing the reason why you want to document such kind of knowledge. And about the ownership, such kind of knowledge is owned communally. It is owned in a collective manner. So some people are very knowledgeable and some they don't know more about the traditional practices because it has been it has not been practiced for a while because of the current education system and some other reasons. So, but the knowledge is owned communally and it is transmitted from one generation to another. About how we could incorporate such knowledge, maybe in the near future we could put it in the learning curriculum, maybe in primary school or high school, the importance of such kind of knowledge, and it will help in making the young people embrace their own culture. Of course, not all the traditional practices are like good. Some of them, they are like the one which are associated with witchcraft. I don't know, some people might not want, like for example, the female genital mutilation, maybe it's outdated. So not everything in the traditional knowledge is like good. So I think those which are important, like for conservation or for social capital, we should promote them. Thank you. So, on the issue of patterning the indigenous knowledge, I'm not too much knowledgeable on that, so maybe you can help me because you are studying law. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a very interesting presentation. Yeah, I'm just perhaps coming back to some of the things that Jos was hinting at. Now, I think it's really, it's extremely important to try to sort of find ways of conserving some of these areas. But I was thinking, one of the things that I sort of struggle with is, we had since the 90s a large debate about, okay, on the one hand, state and militarized type of conservation, and then in the 90s we came up with ideas about bringing in the community, and then eventually also bringing in sort of indigenous knowledge into that. And I think that's really good move. But I think what somehow a lot of people now start realizing that in some conflicts, say about rhinos, elephants, it doesn't work. The community thing, because there is so much money involved, and there's so much sort of the process of industrialization or land claiming in certain areas there's so much money involved, so many interests involved in claiming certain resources. So sort of that idea about bringing communities, because communities are not also divided. Some people have a lot to gain by extracting a certain resource. So I think that, that when I listen to you, I think about, this polarized idea, but on the one hand, militarized state type of conservation, and then you have sort of community, indigenous knowledge type of conservation, and then you also talk about indigenous knowledge versus scientific knowledge. I think what is interesting today is that a lot of these things are being blurred. If you look at some of the scientists working on birds and other things, they have a much more, it's not like this rigid idea about science speaking with one voice, but you start looking at how complex relationship between different species, and water, plants, animals. So a lot of these scientists are, really getting around having a lot of understanding that are similar to the indigenous knowledge. So I don't know if you see what I mean, but I'm just thinking that, don't think so much in a polarized way. Both in terms of the policies and politics of conservation, I think we have to think beyond, because it's not like you can, again, believe that community conservation will, in my understanding, in a lot of contexts it doesn't work, because it's too slow. And sometimes you need to have a very strict sort of militarized conservation to keep, say, certain areas, but then also in terms of knowledge building, it's a lot of interesting, and I think this perhaps is what Jost is saying. There's a lot of interesting thinking now going on, how science and indigenous knowledge are actually coming closer. So I think that my point would be that don't think in this polarized, perhaps.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much for such a good presentation. My name is Benta, and I was also delighted when I heard that you're doing something on conservation in Lake Bogoria. I'm also interested in doing conservation somewhere in Western. So, but I'm wondering, how do you balance development with conservation? Because around Lake Bogoria, there are resorts, hotels coming up, but maybe those are some of the strategic areas for conservation. Then how do you convince the owners of the land that instead of putting up the resort or any other development, they should opt for conservation, because that kind of the economic aspect of it and the cultural aspect of it, how do you balance it?
Okay, thank you so much. I don't have an exact answer for your question, but I think conservationists should address the real issues in conservation. For instance, as you have seen in that video, in wetlands of Bogoria, we have a problem of invasive species known as Prosopis juliflora, and it is really displacing wetlands. We no longer have like freshwater systems, and that place is a semi-arid place, so we are losing the wetlands that we have, the freshwater wetlands. So the conservationists should come up with maybe integrated management system of managing such kind of invasive species. Another thing is the issue of human-wildlife conflict. Maybe they should propose like some farming practices which are less destroyed by wild animals, like maybe agroforestry or such kind of. They should recommend to the locals and support them to embrace the farming practices which minimize water usage and minimize also the human-wildlife conflict. So, like, they should address the real issues as the community develop. The conservationists should help them, and they should promote even ecotourism activities like cultural tourism, avitourism, and such kind of things which are friendly to the environment.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. One thing I just wanted to ask a bit more detail about was that in the documentary, at some point, you yourself mentioned that the indigenous communities should be benefiting economically more from the conservation areas. I just wondered if you could give me some more details on like how you think that could work and how far that would go to solve the issues of conflict between the kind of centralized government conservation system and the community.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think most of the time the community are not involved in planning conservation activities, and they are not involved in decision making. So, and even in jobs, they are not considered for job opportunities. So I think when it comes to conservation, the local community should be involved even in making decisions. Like they are giving like 10% of the annual income from the Bogoria National Reserve to the local community in form of bursary. But those bursaries, it is management of Bogoria National Reserve who control the bursaries and all those kind of things. So you don't know how it works and what is really the 10%, what was the total and everything. It's not, there's no accountability and transparency. So I think in order to promote conservation, they should address the real issues facing the conservation area, like the issue that I had mentioned about the human-wildlife conflict. We are a pastoralist community, and now we are trying to do subsistence farming. So with the help of maybe the agricultural institutions that are there in Kenya, they can help the community to come up with farming practices which are friendly to the environment and which are reducing the human-wildlife conflict and minimizing the water usage. And also, they should also help the community maybe when it comes to the issue of invasive species, and such kind of things should be addressed, not like giving people bursaries. I think when you give someone bursary, you are not really helping that person, because you should address the strong efforts of the community to fix the problems which are there.
Perhaps I should ask the last one regarding the decision by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I don't know, I think it's several years now since that decision regarding the Ndorois. Has it had any impact in terms of the protection of the cultural rights of the Ndoro's people to practice their culture, their religion, etc., etc.
I think it has had some impact because at the moment now we are recognized as an indigenous community, and there was some compensation which the community was supposed to receive, but again there is politics, so it's a mixture of things, and also maybe we need experts to guide us in how we should maybe document our knowledge and do such kind of things. We don't have like many experts in the field of conservation, anthropology, and protection of indigenous knowledge, such kind of things.
I'm sorry to intervene here, but there's a fundamental problem here with the idea of documenting traditional knowledge, right? As soon as you write it down, it no longer exists.
Sorry?
Right? As soon as you write knowledge down, as soon as you try and document it, no longer, you've already killed it, you've already changed it. If you're talking about a practice or a knowledge or something and you try and document it, or if you try and patent it, which actually implies commercialization, right? In other words, it implies a kind of putting a new kind of value on it, or commercial value. You've already killed the knowledge, it's gone. Right? It's gone. Well, I mean, this is kind of what I'm getting at, where I'm saying we need to think much harder. The opportunities exist not just for transforming something that we've labelled indigenous knowledge and then putting it on a piece of paper and then putting it in a school and whatever. The opportunity exists for reconceptualising what we think knowledge is in the first place. And anything short of that kind of radical approach is always going to be what you've called indigenous knowledge falling second or third or fourth fiddle to the nature narrative. So until, there's a radical assertion of a completely different way of understanding the world and human space in it, I agree this is big, but that's the point. Unless you see the potential for a radical alternative for understanding knowledge, for understanding human-animal relations, unless you follow that, you're always going to be playing second or third or fourth or 10th fiddle to a dominant narrative coming from the outside, which is exactly the same narrative that leads to the commercialization, the exploitation, and so you have to. There's not actually no choice, because anything short of that is just giving in. Right? I know it sounds radical, and it doesn't have to sound that radical, and someone in a less radical framework could put all of that less radically. However, unless you follow that through, people are just giving in.
How would you suggest that it's done? Because it's really good, but how would it be done?
But perhaps you can just think here, as a question that there might be some voices within your community who are articulating radical points of views.
Yeah.
Because for me, when I listen, on the one hand, it's like, okay, you are given a slot. Okay, you are supposed now you have different NGOs giving, collect and document your indigenous knowledge, and you do it in an orderly way, and we will give you a space that you can do certain things. Okay, but there might be some voices in your community that are much more radical, a little bit like you're saying, that we are the ones calling the shots. They might be sort of marginal voices, but listen to these voices perhaps that articulate some of these radical. Think completely different. They don't think conservation, they think that we are living in this land, we are part of the land, and we engage with the animals and the water and the resources in a very different way. So that's a completely different story that comes from that, rather that is not documenting indigenous knowledge in a pre-packed manner that a lot of these NGOs and organizations are asking of. Do you see what I mean? So I think that would be absolutely one.
But I think if we don't talk about it, if we don't write anything about it, then we are losing the indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge. So
I see your dilemma, and in many respects what I'm pushing for is several steps down the line, but maybe there is a way in which you can play the game to a certain extent in such a way as to open up the possibility for changing the rules of the game, right? That's basically it. Because at the moment, if you just say, right, let's get our community, let's have a little workshop, let's write down our thing, you're just playing the conservation game. You're playing the game of the people, of the very people, the very game that is causing the problems for you. So if you can play that game in a way in which you can then change the rules of the game, that would be the way forward. And perhaps what Pepe was saying earlier about acknowledging, rather than always putting the emphasis back on the traditional, the self, if you like, actually start pointing the holes in the other side, right? And there are plenty of them. By sort of, for example, instead of saying, well, questioning what is traditional, which is the first question that's going to come up, right? You have a workshop on traditional knowledge, the first question that will come up will be a massive argument about, well, what actually is traditional? And one clan will say this, and one old lady from another clan will say that, and there'll be a big mess, and at the end of it, everyone will be like, oh shit, we don't know what traditional is. And then the people who are sponsoring the workshop, the conservation money, they'll be like, well, these guys don't even know they're traditional, this is so problematic. You can almost see that happening in front of us. Why? Because the notion of tradition that's being pushed forward by the big money is it doesn't make any sense. But maybe the way to do it is to turn it around and to say, well, science doesn't make any sense either. And to start picking the holes in that. And then taking the kind of line that Beppe was saying, which is saying, well, the grey areas. Actually, the grey areas are they reveal science, the illusion of science, and the illusion of truth, the illusion of biology, as much as they might reveal the illusion of culture or tradition. Right? So that might be another way of doing it. But I sympathise with your predicament. Not just your predicament, but the predicament these people are in. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it's about money and about power, right? It's about power, who owns the resources and who has the right to determine the framework of knowledge in which we are engaging with this problem. Right?
I agree with him fully, and I would just add my perspective from law and what I have done in my research, because there is that question of power, even in terms of the enactment of the intellectual property laws that are meant to protect knowledge. And so I stand from the perspective that we can't use intellectual property frameworks to protect indigenous knowledge, because IP is informed by a different worldview. Traditional knowledge is informed by a different worldview about society, about the environment, about culture. And so I make the point that if we are to use IP, we will still fall into this trap of looking at traditional knowledge from the views of the dominant intellectual framework. And I use the same argument even with respect to environmental policies that we have even in this country. If you look at our environmental policies, our IP policies, they don't mention explicitly traditional knowledge. And they do not acknowledge even the importance of protecting it from a traditional perspective. And that's why in my research, I am emphasizing on the importance of using communities themselves and traditional governance structures, because it's only by looking at the worldviews of these people that you can be able to really understand what are the objectives of protecting this knowledge amongst the people. And one of the institutions that are found amongst the communities that I've been working with is the traditional justice systems that they have. And if you look, for example, among the Rabai, amongst the Mijikenda, they have their own institution for resolution of all conflicts arising out of the exploitation of the Kaya forest. And they even have their own guards, apart from the forest guards that are employed by the state, who actually discipline and punish people who encroach into the Kaya forest, because the Kaya forest, most of them are intact. So I fully agree with him that using the dominant frameworks, be they the scientific frameworks about knowledge, frameworks about law, we will not go far. And we need to be quite radical. When I was presenting my proposal, I thought I would get a negative reaction, but the people are quite happy, because even at WIPO, within the World Intellectual Property Framework, there is still this problem about how can we protect traditional knowledge. you know, and we have realized there is a challenge with using the intellectual property framework in protecting this kind of knowledge.
Thank you. So what you guys are just suggesting is that we should treat them differently, like the scientific knowledge and the indigenous knowledge differently, or am I getting you wrong?
I think what I was suggesting, sorry, Freda.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about that. To me, and I've been thinking about this as you are presenting and as we were discussing this. Traditional knowledge, whatever we are calling science here, is nothing new to the people that you are studying and what they do. Because right in your presentation, you showed things like the reeds or whatever from the swamp. They can tell you it will take 6 months before they can go to harvest again, right? So they already know. They know where the crane goes. They know which trees they should not cut because this is where it's going to have its next. Yeah, but you go there and start studying, write down, make documentaries, do all these things, but they already know. So that boundary between traditional knowledge and science, it doesn't exist. It's just something that people are documenting and writing it. Sure, it's just like when you see somebody coming here and saying, who discovered Mount Kenya, right? People have been living here like forever. So they know Mount Kenya, they have seen it all the time, but when somebody comes and documents that Krav discovered Mount Kenya, and then it's taught in schools that he discovered Mount Kenya. You see? So I think what Bep and Yost are saying is that we should actually look at this, what we are calling traditional knowledge and science, as one and the same thing and bring it out as such. But my problem is when you see a lot of people talking about militarization and also conservation, it's like some form of resistance to what is happening now. Because local people, communities have been left out, as she is saying. So the kind of knowledge that we are talking about here is knowledge that has not been acknowledged. So for it to be acknowledged, then this is why people come out and start writing things or say, we are here. Actually, that's what they are saying. We are here. We've lived with these animals and we've been able to protect them and the land and everything. So I think we are looking at two things here. We are looking at nature and culture, and we are looking at local people versus international NGOs and everyone else who is coming here to protect things that have always been protected by their owners.
I'm afraid I 100% agree with you, and this is why I've been trying to say this is great, but you need to go further, because and actually it's really depressing, because Pepe said this. These are debate. When I was an undergraduate student in the 90s, we were having discussions around this kind of issue. And in that time, people were saying, oh, we've got to get rid of fortress conservation, we've got to start doing traditional conservation, and then we started saying, well, what do we mean by traditional, etc., etc. These debates have been going on for at least 20 years. And it depresses me that there are still situations where, in that 20-year period, what's happened is actually, in many respects, the indigenous conservation lobby are the good guys, and they've been on the retreat in the face of militarized fortress conservation, which has been resurgent in a very big way. And so, in a sense, it depresses me that we're still having this conversation. Because I thought we were having this conversation 20 years ago, and that by 20 years on, we could have a more sophisticated conversation to say, well, how can we actually use something we call indigenous conservation in a way that doesn't just rarefy a dominant narrative. But we've still got such a long way to go. I mean, on the other issue, they're not separate. Absolutely. Traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge are not separate. I would argue what we should be pushing for is the contingency of all knowledge. In other words, all knowledge, there's no such thing as historical knowledge in the sense that this has always been like this. Knowledge is produced every moment as we speak. And it's in the interaction between all of us. So the idea of holding something still, turning it into heritage is a problem, because you're holding it still, you're not allowing it to develop. And the key thing is, who are the players who are acknowledged in that moment in a production of knowledge? Yeah? And maybe so-called indigenous knowledge can be used to push back and reveal the contingency of science Well, the law pretends it's fixed, but it's contingent. Everything is contingent. Yeah? Maybe through pushing forward the radical character who throws a spanner in the works at the workshop and tells the NGO boss to go away and rethink, for example. I don't know. We're pointing in the right direction. I just thought over 20 years we would have got way beyond this point. It's really depressing.
Let me say this, then I give you. About indigenous knowledge and protection, I think that's a big problem. But I think we should also think about patenting some of the things that need to be patented is like medicines, right? Things that people will use to industrialize them, and then people who came up with that don't get anything out of it. So I think this is some of the knowledge that people are talking about. And if you remember, there were problems with kikoi and other things that have been produced locally, and they go somewhere else, someone else patents them, and then they don't belong to that community anymore, or the individual that came up with the idea. So I think that is the kind of thing they are looking at.
But I was thinking, do we need to... Okay, sure. No, I was thinking because, I mean, in order to really talk about this case, for me, I would have sort of have to sit down and map all the actors, you know. Okay, so you have these wetlands areas, who are the people around, I mean, this indigenous community. I mean, I do see it's an extremely positive step that the indigenous community coming up and claiming a voice. But we really, to talk about this seriously, we have to really understand what is going on, you know. And as somebody mentioned about hotels coming up and this and that, so we have to know the interests that are trying to claim this resource. But I was just a small thing that I was thinking about is that rather than talk about knowledge perhaps, because knowledge really gives you the idea, you see it like a package. Okay, we have knowledge here. So think about other terms, say different ways of inhabiting the world. So your guys, your community, you inhabit this place in a different way. And when you start talking about that, recording that, how people inhabit, you know, it's a different version of, and it has to do with knowledge, but it's a different, yeah.
And it preferably in indigenous semantics, actually, right? So rather than saying knowledge as a package, think about, well, what is the language that people are using themselves to describe their existence in and with the world, you know?
Okay, I didn't ask, but I'll say maybe mostly it's about, as I said, it's more about people saying we are here more than anything else. And documenting or as you're saying, different semantics about people living and what they do and all that. I think this has been done a lot of times, in relation to animals, in relation to buildings, in relation to all types of culture that we have. But then the problem is, she's talking about economic gains. And for economic gains, unless, as you just said, the radicalization that we would like to see is whereby maybe somebody comes up and says, the NGOs must go. Because then this is why you see the people that she was talking about, now they are killing, people within their drawers, they are killing the animals that they were protecting before, because they are not benefiting from them. And they feel they are not consulted. At least I got that from, so
they should just kill the animals. I mean,
that's what they are doing. They are poisoning them, they are doing whatever. And this is why there will be militarization to stop this, instead of looking at where the problem is, in my opinion.
I think what you're saying, Fredo, is that alongside the finance theoretical discussion about knowledge production, which is kind of what's been going on here, which we think is very important because it's tied in with the politics, and it probably is, there's also a very immediate problem, which is to do with, say, knowledge, at one level, knowledge about, you know, a vegetable matter that is a medicine being stolen. That's a very immediate problem. There's also an immediate problem of, you know, people with guns coming in and shooting people, other people and so on. So there needs to be a radical politics and an active politics alongside a radical rethinking, and the two have to be intertwined.
Yeah, I think it's about economic gains, because even at the moment, the community is not allowed to carry on with their hunting regulation that they had in the past. So they are not allowed to hunt any animal, and in the past they used to have a way of, like during famine, there are some people who are allowed to eat wild meat, because if you don't have livestock and you are considered poor in the community, there is sometimes you are allowed to do hunting, to eat bushmeat during famine. But for now, this is not allowed, and it's managed by maybe the KWS and the Kenyan government, so they are not considering all those kind of things. So that's why the community, at the end of the day, they say, okay, we have a lot of touristic activity in Bogoria, and there's so much money coming in, but we are not benefiting in one way or another in terms of jobs, in terms of any development of ecotourism activities or cultural tourism activities. There is nothing. So at the end of the day, there is nothing the community is gaining. So they are engaging in activities which are not friendly to the environment, because that's where they get the money from. But if the conservationists and the government could invest in activities that are environmental friendly, it will go a long way in giving money to the community, and at the same time for conservation. For example, Baringo is very good in beekeeping, and there is a very good quality of honey from the acacia. But at the moment, the locals are doing charcoal from acacia, courtesy of the Prosopis juliflora. And at the end of the day, the community is after the money. And beekeeping now is going down, and the charcoal burning is going up. There's no one who is the policy of the forestry policy of 2005, which gave permission for people to exploit prosopis for charcoal burning. There is no regulation on the ground, and people are harvesting acacia. So there are so many issues around conservation. So it should not just be, it should be addressed in a multidisciplinary way.
I mean, a part of the problem is the way in which you determine the political debate, because if you reframe animal hunting or acacia burning or charcoal burning as a political act of resistance against the dominant narrative, it suddenly looks different. But at the moment, if you go and hunt a greater hoodoo, right, you just get framed as a poacher or as a thief, right? But actually, you could say, I'm going to kill the kudu and stick a massive flag in this carcass and say, this is my fucking kudu, and I'm going to hunt it according because it belongs to me. And then it becomes framed as a political act. The problem is that the debates that exist don't allow that. So the only permitted act of resistance are these kind of NGO debates around indigenous knowledge, which are profoundly ineffective. So that is actually, so in that sense, Fredo, maybe that's one of the links between what you're saying, which is the political side, and what we're talking about the theoretical side, which is, there is a link between those two, which is how do you frame political action in a way that gets noticed. Yeah. Beekeeping as political action.
Yeah, maybe. Do you have any more questions? Okay, let's put our words together. I think that this has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Joylene, for coming to talk to us about this. And as I said before, it was a continuation of what we had. And she was at the NMK, so that is good. At least she saw what people are thinking about conservation and all that, and a point of view of indigenous knowledge. Thank you so much.